I've been working at the Center for Rural Strategies for almost 3 months now, and I still don't really know what rural means.
Rural America is a Rorschach ink blot test.
Let's say there are two kinds of rural. There's like a rural of the head and a rural of the heart.
Rural people and rural places are real important to me.
I think of community, kindness, and warmth.
Rural is walking to the post office every morning, to visit your neighbors, to learn the latest news and gossip.
Staying within sight and sound of each other and the land.
Rural is rain on a tin roof and hoping that the power doesn't go out.
You know, they say that it's not where you are, it's who you're with. But with rural, it's where you are and who you're with.
To me, rural is a state of mind. It's a work in progress. It's a place that brings me peace, and ultimately it's home.
No one has the same answer for what rural is because the strict definitions don't really cut it.
I've seen conferences start with the speaker saying, we want to get into our program, but first let's just very quickly define what we mean by rural. And 90 minutes later, they still haven't come to any agreement on how they're going to define rural.
Rural is contradictory, kind of not consistent.
Rural is coveting your neighbor's camper.
Potter Stewart, the justice, said about obscenity. I don't know that I have a definition, but I know it when I see it.
I mean, it's the glacier lakes of the Adirondacks where you're spending some time in your old age, but it's also the coal fields of central Appalachia and industrial rural where you grew up.
Rural is going around the mountain to visit your cousins before the strip mine took it all away.
You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy.
I think of neighbors being great friends. I think of local politicians knowing their constituents on a first-name basis.
Rural is kind of just a vibe.
You're always going to leave something out, and someone is always going to have a, well, what about this question? And they're probably right.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Gong, and I'm the board chair of the Center for Rural Strategies. I hope you're enjoying Rural Assembly Everywhere. It's my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. But first, I'd like to recap a few of the topics we've explored at this remarkable virtual gathering: the impending 2020 general election, the shifting rural vote, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, above all, the need for greater civility and public discourse, and the restoration of our social contract. Our keynote speaker, Kathleen Sebelius, has been engaged in health policy for decades in the public and private sectors. She graduated from Trinity Washington University before earning a Master of Public Administration degree from the University of Kansas. She was elected statewide in Kansas 4 times as governor and as insurance commissioner. And she served in President Obama's cabinet as U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, where she worked for better and more equitable public health policy. Currently, Sebelius is the CEO of Sebelius Resources, LLC. She serves on a number of health sector boards, and she continues policy work with the Kaiser Family Foundation and co-leads the Health Strategy Group for the Aspen Institute. Thanks again for joining us for this Rural Assembly Everywhere, and please stick around for breakout sessions following the main stage speakers. Above all, keep it rural. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. It's Kathleen Sebelius, and I am delighted to be joining the Rural Assembly today. I want to start with a shout out to my friend Dee Davis and the great work that he does and the team on rural issues and rural connectedness. I want to acknowledge that you're going to hear from a Kansas superstar, Sarah Smarsh, in the program, and two friends and colleagues, Celinda Lake and Rich Besser, both of whom I've had the opportunity to work with and know over a number of years. I'm really struck by the fact that in the materials put out for the Rural Assembly, you talk about the 50 million Americans who call rural areas home, but then those of us who are bound by cultural ties to family and landscape and stories, and I would fit into that category. I'm married to a guy from rural Kansas. I had the opportunity and great honor to be the governor of Kansas for 2 terms, and Kansas is a pretty rural state. 2/3 of our landmass is very sparsely populated. Most of the population lives in the strip of Kansas at the very eastern side of the state. We have county after county as you head west toward Colorado that are older and poorer, but also rich in tradition and culture, home to not only a lot of the food produced and cattle that is raised and slaughtered in this country, but communities where people love to live and work and raise their families. I worked for a president after being governor of Kansas who had ties to rural America. Barack Obama asked me to take the job as Secretary of Health and Human Services. And we had a connection since 2004. The president's mother and grandparents were Kansans. And so he always attributed his Midwestern values and the thoughts that he had about fairness and equity to those Midwestern roots. And we actually had a pact with one another. He wasn't wild about his governor, so I became his governor, and I wasn't crazy about our senator, so he became my senator. And that was a pretty good relationship before he was elected president. I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes today talking a bit about the Affordable Care Act and health in rural America and how the debate about this law could help or hinder populations in rural America, about Medicaid expansion, which is part of that law and has a huge impact, about some issues that are front and center in our social discourse right now, and then about some of the lights that COVID-19 has actually helped to shine on rural health issues and rural connectivity issues altogether. So the Affordable Care Act had a 10th birthday in March. I'm sure all of you had it on your calendars and celebrated with a small party. But 10 years ago, on March 23rd of 2010, Barack Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law. And it did a couple of things, but the front and center were having affordable health coverage for individuals who didn't have employment-based health coverage that was either affordable or available. So the government helped to pay the share that employers would often pay in someone's health plan, and then offered all states in the country the opportunity to expand Medicaid for the lowest income workers with mostly federal funding, 3 years of 100% funding and gradually decreasing to 90% funding. Those are the well-known features. The Affordable Care Act also doubled the federal dollars going into federally qualified health centers, specifically located in underserved areas of this country where there are not enough providers and not enough access to health care. Many of those are in rural areas. It had features to help Medicare beneficiaries, people over 65, a number of whom live in rural areas, pay for prescription drugs, get annual wellness visits. It improved the payment of some of the healthcare providers in the Medicare space. So it impacted older Americans, and then had a feature in it for everyone in the under Medicare age group, where insurance companies were prohibited from continuing their discrimination against people with pre-existing health conditions. So unless you worked for a big company and you were in the so-called marketplace trying to buy insurance, you were a farm family trying to buy coverage for your family, you were in a small mom and pop job trying to get coverage for your business, what the law allowed was insurance companies to look at individual health of those who they were insuring, either refuse to sell you insurance altogether, raise the prices to a astronomical level so a lot of people just couldn't afford it, or write insurance coverage that eliminated all the medical conditions that you really were most worried about. For heart attack survivors, it could be, we'll take care of everything but your heart. For cancer survivors, we won't deal with anything to do with ongoing cancer treatment. And that was legal. And that happened each and every day. Had a huge impact on lots of folks in rural America, given the fact that there are not the large group employers often in many of the less populated parts of the state. So lots of people were either buying their own coverage or looking for coverage. So that changed a decade ago. And what we have now is a very precarious situation where all of that is on the line, where the Trump administration has gone to the Supreme Court through a case that has wended its way through the court and argued that the entire law should be struck down. That oral argument will take place on the 10th of November, a week after the election. But the Trump administration, rather than defending the 10-year-old law of the land, has said, get rid of the whole thing. There has never been a health plan as a replacement. And not only would a lot of those benefits that I've described for individual populations just vanish, but Medicaid expansion, which has now been adopted by 39 states, including the District of Columbia, would be struck down at the same time. And I can tell you, living in a state where I'm ashamed to say in Kansas, we still have not expanded Medicaid. The legislature has voted numbers of times to expand. First, we had a Republican governor who vetoed the expansion, and his veto couldn't be overridden. We elected a new governor in 2018. So in 2019, she tried again to expand, and it was blocked by some legislative leadership and some political maneuvering. So we're still a state looking for that additional federal help for healthcare, looking for benefits for 150,000 Kansans who have qualified for those benefits since January of 2014, but the politics in this state has prevented those individuals from accessing the benefit. And I'll tell you what we've seen in that period of time. We've had 3 rural hospitals shutter their doors. In every case, in each of those communities, the CEO of the hospital said one of the major reasons they could no longer afford to operate, one of the principal reasons they were closing their doors, is there was still too much care that they had to deliver without bills being paid. The CEOs talked very specifically about the failure in Kansas to expand Medicaid, to have those federal dollars flow into the state, which could pay for care not only in the urban parts of the state, but in very rural parts of the state, where now our citizens are without a healthcare center, where they don't have access to a hospital. If indeed the Affordable Care Act is struck down, that will happen all over this country, including the states where expansion has taken place. What we know is about 20 million people have new insurance coverage either through Medicaid or through the marketplaces that they didn't have before. Joe Biden has said if he's elected, he'd like to expand on that structure. He'd like to make sure that everyone who is buying insurance on their own has help from the federal government, not just people up to a certain income level. He wants to make sure that a public option is put into the health plan, a Medicare-like plan that would lower administrative costs and give people some cost competition for the private marketplace. He wants to make sure that in a state like Kansas, where coverage hasn't yet been expanded, lower income workers would have an opportunity to join a health plan at the national level that looks a lot like Medicaid and take advantage of those benefits. It is heartbreaking, I can tell you, because I've had these conversations with people to explain that they are currently too poor to qualify for help with health care. That sounds crazy, but the way the law was written anticipated that 100% of the states would take advantage of Medicaid expansion, and then there would be subsidy help as you went into the private marketplace. So there are literally people whose incomes are below 100% of poverty. They may be working 2 or 3 jobs. They have no health care, and they do not qualify for any financial help. You know, we've seen a couple of issues that really bring this whole rural healthcare issue front and center. One is the maternal mortality crisis in America. It is less safe right now in the United States of America to have a baby than it is in most countries around the world. It's a shocking place to be, where a lot of countries, including developing countries, have lowered their maternal mortality rates. And in the U.S., in the last 10 years, they have gone up. We lose twice as many moms between the time that she gets pregnant and a year after the child's birth, twice as many as our neighbors do in Canada. And a whole series of issues have been looked at around that crisis, and they include access to affordable health care, particularly in a number of areas in the state where Medicaid has not been expanded and people just don't have regular prenatal care. They don't have regular access to doctors. Transportation is a huge issue. So again, going back to my Kansas example, we now have communities where pregnant women have to travel much further to get a checkup, much further if something happens in the pregnancy, which could require hospitalization, much further to find a qualified OBGYN. And we know housing is an issue, again, can often present itself in rural areas. It's I think, a hidden health crisis often in America, where the issues around availability and access and transportation and housing really is killing women in the United States at a much higher rate than should happen when they try to have a baby, a totally natural part of a life cycle. It's something that is more prevalent in rural areas, and I think a huge challenge as we look to the future. Another recent challenge that has come to light over the last number of years is in the opioid misuse and abuse situation, where people have become addicted to drugs in a way that is killing large swaths of the population. And again, very prevalent in rural areas of the country, as well as urban areas. But in a number of the rural areas, if you don't have Medicaid expansion, you really can't pay for effective treatment. You may not have access to residential treatment, which is highly effective. You may not have a healthcare provider who can deal with a patient on a regular basis. And again, what we know is that is not only a health crisis, but it's a mortality crisis. We lose many more people in some of the rural areas of the state with drug use issues than we do in other areas. And a lot of it has to do with health qualifications. So this is an issue that's kind of front and center. And I think there could not be a more dramatic difference between the two presidential candidates about what their view is of health and health issues into the future. So now we're in the middle of a pandemic, a national and global health crisis that has ravaged this country, ravaged the economy, and is now presenting in rural areas of the state. So as of today, we have 8.8 million cases in the United States, which is a 39% increase in the last 14 days. Think of that, 39% more cases. And in spite of what the president continues to insist that it's just because we're doing more testing that we have more cases, that is not accurate. The case positivity rate is well outpacing the increase in testing. And the hospital rates are going up. And unfortunately, we're seeing death rates of nearly 1,000 people a day. None of that has to do with testing. It has to do with the fact that these cases are now, again, continuing to ravage the country. We've had 227,000 deaths in the United States, which is an increase of 13% in the last 2 weeks. And this is a pandemic that started in the Northeast and Northwest. New York and Seattle were the first outbreaks, and they dealt with it. We then watched the disease move to the middle of the country and the southern tier where the Sun Belt was hit as the spring and summer unfolded. But now it's in the heart of the Midwest. And I want to use Kansas again as an example of what's happening. So my husband grew up in Norton, Kansas, which is about 20 miles from the Nebraska border and about 60 miles from the Colorado border, up in the northwest corner of our state. And, we're the bullseye of the country. We are halfway north, south, east, and west in the United States. So what's happening here is happening throughout the Midwestern states. We are seeing a huge spike in virus in rural communities. Norton, Kansas, according to the New York Times today, is now the second highest county in the country for per capita cases. There's a small nursing home in Norton, Kansas, a population of less than 5,000 people, a nursing home that holds 61 patients. All 61 were positive as of 2 weeks ago, as were many of the staff members. 100% positivity rate. 10 people have already died. The county commission and healthcare professionals are not able to handle the hospital patients that are required because Norton doesn't have ICU beds. It doesn't have the skilled personnel who can save people's lives. So they are desperately trying to transport these very ill patients to surrounding areas. But surrounding areas also are seeing a spike in cases. What's happening in Kansas is happening in North and South Dakota. It's happening in various rural areas. And I think shines a light on the 14% of the country who lives in non-metro areas. And their health concerns are both about access, but also about personnel. You can't save a COVID patient if you don't have highly trained personnel and if you don't have the equipment and isolation beds to deal with them. We have a perfect storm. Older residents, a number of whom have underlying health conditions and less access to highly skilled medical personnel. So it's a nightmare waiting to happen, and we are seeing it right now play out today in the United States. I think if there's any upside to that situation, it is that hopefully when we figure out ways to contain the virus, when we have a safe and effective vaccine that can be distributed equitably and fairly throughout our country, when we have an opportunity to feel safe and secure about protecting our most vulnerable populations, we've seen some changes during the pandemic, which I think can be incredibly beneficial in rural communities. One is just a realistic look at access to healthcare and access to regional healthcare that has to, again, be invested in. We've also seen telehealth, which can be a huge help in many less densely parts of the country, advance about 10 years. The issues and discussions around telehealth pre-pandemic were limited by payers' willingness to, pay for a psychiatric exam for a kid sitting in a rural part of the country with a mental health professional in a different part of the country. That's gone. We know that many doctors and highly trained professionals won't live in rural areas unless they have access to specialists in a different part of the state. You can't exchange medical information as quickly. So telehealth with payers willing to pay for a broad range of health issues could greatly increase healthcare access, particularly specialty care healthcare access in rural America. But it's also tied to a bright light shown on what is a continuing gap in broadband capacity, in effective, fast internet. We saw it with schools trying to pivot, where if you are in an area that does not have fast connectivity, you are really in deep trouble trying to switch to a remote learning platform. You can't have access to the same kind of situation. Now, that has always been the case in rural America. It's what we know is about 80% of the 24 million people without reliable internet capacity live in rural parts of the country, north, south, east, and west. But it's never been as urgent as it is right now. If we are moving businesses and schools to remote learning, to remote working opportunities, you can't do that unless you have reliable internet. So I think it will spawn also a very dramatic increase in getting that last mile of broadband, getting that internet, which has been long promised but never delivered. It also is key in the healthcare system. You can't exchange healthcare information without reliable internet. You can't get information about what an outbreak looks like. You can't send data in. Rural hospitals are at a disadvantage with even electronic medical records if they can't rely on fast internet. So I do think that part of the recovery from COVID will be a very serious and urgent investment in some of the areas that we know have been long-standing barriers in rural communities, but now are just simply unacceptable as you look at a nation that has had to pivot to remote learning, remote work, remote healthcare. So I guess in summing up, we have a couple of serious crises facing us. We're in the midst of a pandemic, which has had lots of work implications. People have lost their livelihoods and they've lost their lives. We have healthcare expansion that is under threat from the current administration and will be argued in the Supreme Court. The new president could have a lot to do with, even if the court makes an unfavorable decision, whether or not that healthcare is replaced, whether or not Congress quickly passes a bill to put in place protection for people who have lost health coverage, and particularly making sure that insurance companies can never discriminate again. I guess I tend to be a bit optimistic as I look at the future. I think the opportunity is there for a post 9/11 moment in this country where we really have a reckoning about where the gaps are in health disparities, where we have exposed sharp access gaps, where we have huge challenges and problems like maternal mortality and opioid crisis, which will never be solved without a much more universal look at healthcare, where we know that broadband is a huge issue, but we've seen it starkly play out, and that there'll be an urgency as we look at recovery from this pandemic of fixing some of the issues that we've talked about and documented, but never really met the challenge. I think the other piece of this puzzle that I find potentially quite uplifting is that as we look at a smarter, greener, more inclusive America, as the Rural Assembly language has pointed out, that a lot of people in this country are rethinking space. They're rethinking place. They are thinking more about land and nature as being valuable assets as opposed to densely packed and populated centers. I think we've seen people pivot to old skills and often forgotten traits of learning how to cook all over again, figuring out natural ingredients, growing their own food, all traits that lend themselves, I think, to a reappreciation of rural spaces and rural areas. And hopefully, if we can combine solving some of the huge challenges, and healthcare and speedy communications are among them, with this new sense of the value of some of the lands which have been forgotten, some of the skills which have been overlooked, and some of the places that we have across this country that could be highlighted as wonderful opportunities and areas to live, as opposed to continuing both the brain drain and the flee to the cities. I think there could be a real upswing after this very dark period in our history. Space and nature have huge priorities. I think the rural way of life is becoming reevaluated and more valued. And hopefully this can be a moment of reckoning where our rebuilding, or as Joe Biden would say, building back better, can include some significant investments that have been too long discussed and overlooked, and again, create a new platform for rural life in America in a way that we have new appreciation for and can teach generations to come. So again, thank you for letting me join you today. I'm going to turn back to Whitney, who I think is going to field some questions for me, and I hope you have a great assembly.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. You really spoke to so many of the issues and topics that we've been thinking about and speaking about this last week. On Monday, we had a conversation with Celinda Lake and Ed Goaz about the rural vote and polling in rural. And there are a couple of questions here that I think you might be interested in speaking to. One is from our friend Dee, where he mentions that both Democrat Celinda Lake and Republican Ed Goaz said they are seeing movement with rural women's votes in this cycle. And we want to know what your experience has been like in working with women on the campaign trail.
Well, I think, first of all, women will control this election. In every presidential election since 1980, the percentage of women has outvoted the percentage of men. And since 1964, the number of women have outvoted the number of men. In 2016, the last presidential election, 10 million more women voted. So this election will be determined by women. I would start there. I think that, there is an issue that's sort of swirling that women seem to be more sensitive to than men, which deals with the value of health and the value of life. And we see that in the discussions around COVID. We have seen a president and a number, I would say, of his followers in the Republican Party talk a lot about the stock market being the barometer of whether or not America is moving in the right direction or not, that being the measure of whether or not there's success or failure. I think women are much more focused on whether people are living or dying, what's the safety of themselves and their children and their grandchildren, how we balance that with economics. Women are struggling with the multiple jobs that they are, again, trying to do, working from home, providing childcare, being the at-home teacher to their kids, along with household duties and others. That seems to be falling more heavily on women. And we see more women dropping out of the workforce because those pressures have grown. We see women who are essential workers terrified about where they are going to have their children cared for that's safe and secure. And we see a lot of people worried about children not in school, not only not thriving and excelling, but not eating, not being in a safe place. So unfortunately, we're still seeing a gender gap in who's worrying about what. But I think that the kinds of concerns that women have and the kinds of health concerns that are raised and safety concerns seem much more balanced, I would say, in women and moms and grandmothers who are being talked to and have lent themselves to really people who might be traditionally Republican are really tired of a president who, as recently as yesterday, as cases are spiking, as deaths are beginning to rise again, as hospitals are filling up in rural parts of the state. And we have a president who's saying, COVID, 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 can't talk about anything else. Let's talk about reopening, and criticizing again the female governor of Michigan for her health and safety concerns. I don't think women think that's a really good idea. And I think when they think about themselves and their families, they're saying, I want somebody who's going to put our health and security first.
Thank you. We have several more questions that are in a similar vein, and it speaks to some of what we talked about yesterday with poet and theologian Padraig Otuma. We were talking about divisiveness and conflict and, where we are in 2020 in terms of our politics and our culture, our clinging to our cultural identities and ideologies in a way. And the question that seems to permeate here is really about no matter who is elected, on the other side of this, how do we get back to a sense of science and of relying on science and believing in government, both, either on both ends?
Well, it's a great question and a huge question because recovery is in part about steps that will be taken, but it's also about, do the American people trust that we have a safe and effective vaccine if an announcement is made? Are they willing to step up and get vaccinated? Because I can tell you that step in and of itself will determine how fast recovery might come. And if less than half the country is willing to be vaccinated, we will continue to see this virus. There's no question there's been an undermining of science. And I can say, I'm a partisan. I was elected in a partisan system, but I also can say historically, there has never been a public health crisis that has been dealt with as a partisan wedge issue until this. And my data points are that when the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Protection, announces a set of rules that are immediately, and I mean the next day, contradicted by the president, who is over the CDC, who is the leader of the government, and says basically don't trust them, don't believe them. I'm not sure that's right. That undermines public confidence. In the past, the science and the scientists have led with their information, which, should and could be updated. They're learning new things. This is a new disease. We don't know enough about it. So they make a pronouncement, they learn a little more, and they say, oh, we were wrong. We think this is now correct based on the data that we're seeing. I mean, we still don't have anybody who has survived 1 year from having COVID. That's how new this disease is. We don't have any idea what that looks like. We don't have any idea how fast people could be reinfected. We don't have any idea what long-term effects are, because we have no long-term. We've been in this for 8 months. So science should be updated. And I just think it's going to be helpful to have the partisan debate get out of the way, to have scientists brief the American public on a regular basis about what they know and what they don't know, to have the politicians cease and desist from having their own views, and they may have opinions, but they don't have their own facts. And I think that's going to be hugely important. And hopefully we can gradually rebuild trust in the American system. But you've seen it undermined in the courts and undermined in the public discourse in legislatures. You've seen it undermined in the health field. And we got a lot of work to do, and the election is not going to magically flip a switch and make all of this mistrust go away. It is going to take a great deal of confidence building, a step at a time, doing what you say you're going to do, helping people's lives get better, making sure that we take the right steps. And it's always going to be a balance between how much economic activity can be had while keeping people safe and secure.
I think we have time for just one more short question, if that's all right.
If I can give you a short answer.
Okay, short answer. Just wondering about the lessons you might have learned from moving from Kansas to Ohio.
It was the other way.
Oh, I'm sorry, the other way. Ohio to Kansas. I'm sorry.
No problem. Well, I grew up in Cincinnati, which is a big city. When I was living there, it was bigger than it is now, but it was a metropolitan area. Then I went to college in Washington, D.C., an even bigger metropolitan area. And then I moved to Kansas. I married a Kansan. And so I had lived in areas where, Ohio had lots of rural areas, but usually within a 50-mile radius of a relatively big-sized city. You couldn't drive very far without hitting a city in Ohio, even if you were in a more rural county in the state. That's not the case in Kansas. There are places like my husband's home area where, it is very rural, not only where he lives, but in a 3-hour radius around him if you drive in any direction. And I think that's a very different kind of lifestyle than I was familiar with. I have grown to greatly appreciate it. I certainly learned a lot about land and land conservation and the importance of sustainability from being in Kansas, the kind of care that farmers and ranchers take of their natural resources, the sort of devotion to the land. I've learned a lot about water issues since I've lived in Kansas, one of the most critical resources that we'll debate in the country. I think, there's a lot about sustainability and resilience from rural communities. And one of the things that I greatly appreciated was this sense, and it's, I think, left over from the early settler days when, somebody's crop needed to come in and there was a family member sick, everybody showed up and did it. If a barn needed to be raised, it was a community endeavor. There really was a sense we're all in this together. And that still exists in lots of rural America. And I think it's missing in lots of urban America. There's signs in people's yards that say that, but there's not really that ethic that, we are really bound to one another, that there are things we've got to do together as a community and as a population that we cannot do by ourselves, and that the public good is more important than each individual's, own ups and downs. That sense of community commonality, common good, I think is one that is really prevalent in many rural areas. Is something that I learned well in Kansas that I appreciate. And then I think a lot of the country is appreciating now as we look to one another as, not only essential neighbors and friends, but we are our brother's keeper. We are our neighbor's keeper. We are responsible for one another in a very human way in this particular time. And I think a lot of people in the western part of Kansas have always felt that. And I think people in the rest of the state are kind of waking up to that.
That's a wonderful way to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for joining us today. Best of luck and stay well.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Everyone stick around for more good programming from Rural Assembly. Coming up is Sarah Smarsh and Benya Kraus.
Hi, I'm Anthony Wiles Jr., and I'm the National Student Poet representing the Northeast region. And today I'll be reading my original poem entitled, Please Come Home. My home exists alone and forgotten, abandoned by every soul it birthed, clung to by the children who never saw it live. Tucked in the holler, cut in half by a creek the mine polluted, and a river the chemical companies dump their waste in, sits the town where the cars don't stop. To an outsider looking in, there isn't much there. You might even say, this place is dead. And in fact, this is the place where the dead man breathes. Forgotten by the world, it forms the most sacred memories of my youth. To me, an outsider by rearing, an insider by love and blood, this is my home. When I am sad, I remember the mountaintop smiles and jokes told under the setting of the cold country sun. I taste the crunchy crust of cornbread and long for my grandmother's soup beans and Miss Vicky's collard greens. My heart beats to the rhythm of the country church choir. My blood flows in the path of Crane Creek. This town you drive through where the cars don't stop is my belonging, my being. I, juxtaposed between urban and rural, forgotten and seen, past and present, know of no other place, no better place to call home. Where many see pain and poverty, and trust me, babe, there's a whole hell of a lot of it. I see a bond, a love that has withstood the worst of the world's evil, yet grown stronger nonetheless. The place I call home cries for her children day and night and chides at a world that ignores her. And the place where my heart is at peace, where people like me are usually not seen, Crystal is calling her babies home. The end.
Hi, I'm Donna Kalner. I live on the Wolf River in rural northern Wisconsin. It's a great place to live if you love to hunt and fish. We also have great snowmobiling, mountain bike trails, canoeing, kayaking, rafting. Outdoor recreation is an important part of our local economy. But what a lot of visitors to areas like this don't know is that most, if not all, of the first responders are volunteers. Motor vehicle accident, structure fire, wildland fire, search and rescue, we're all volunteers. When you have a large geographic area and a small population, it is always a challenge to get enough volunteers. That's why in 2007, after a tornado hit our area, we started training additional volunteers, people who maybe couldn't do firefighter training, but can do jobs that free up firefighters. So we have people trained now to do accountability and rehab at fire scenes. They can do traffic control at motor vehicle accidents, even drive fire trucks to the scene if a firefighter is near that location, so they can go directly to the scene and start to do size up. I'm proud to be a member of the Wolf River Volunteer Fire Department, and I'm honored to be here today to thank all of you who are first responders in your local communities. Your rural areas depend on you. We thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much for watching today. I have the privilege to introduce you to S.G. Goodman. If you haven't heard her album, Old Time Feeling, that came out in July, oh, rush to hear it. It's really I think a soundtrack for people doing hard work in rural America or focusing on rural issues.
I never wanna leave this world without saying I love you, without saying what you mean to me. You know it makes me happy. Oh, when we share this space and time.
So SG, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
So many people who have grown up in rural America face that question of, do you leave? Do you stay? And I know on one of your songs on the album, you address that pretty directly and say, you know, what about staying here and being the change you want to see?
You know, I would say it starts with some personal things. I am a gay woman in the South. I know a lot of feedback and response to that from my community. Certain people really, after you're able to separate yourself from the hurt of being rejected, you know, hopefully you have the courage to do some processing where you can understand and make sense of why a person's worldview is the way it is. And I believe strongly that if people don't have examples of, you know, quote unquote, a successful, regular old person who's, you know, maybe in a minority group or whatever right there in front of them, then yeah, they're always going to view that as the other and something that they don't understand, really because of lack of representation. Staying in this area and just being a good neighbor makes a bigger impact than one could imagine, because I am someone who, at least my neighbors on this street, people I see in the grocery store, they know that maybe they know that I'm a gay woman and that I'm, you know, just kind of a regular girl who shows up to the grocery in sweatpants. I don't know. Because I always like to say this. I do make a plea for people to stick around and change. But I understand, one, why that's been difficult for me. Why staying in a place that is harmful for your mental health, or in many cases, people could be physically harmed. That I'm not sitting here telling them to sacrifice themselves. I think this is, you know, right now and there have been times when I haven't felt safe, but for the most part, I feel safe and comfortable in my surroundings. And so I do feel, you know, called to be here at this moment. Now, I'm a big traveler. I want to experience new things in my life. I feel like traveling gives you a better sense of home and your place there. So I'm not going to say I'm not going to jump ship and live other places at some point in my life, but I do see great value in investing yourself into the South in places that, one, need your vote, two, need your representation, and three, a place where you can afford a house a lot of times.
Oh, and out in the woods, this picture is clear to me. All my life, to even my enemies, the ones who have loved me, the ones who have tried, their grips on my heart and their grips on my mind. The stranger I passed, my mama, brothers, friends, and my father, they're God undercover. I'm telling you now, in case I must go, want you to know I never wanna leave this world without saying I love you, without saying what you mean to me. Oh, you know it makes me happy. Oh, when we share this space and time, want you to know you shaped this heart of mine. And I never wanna leave this world, without saying I love you. I never wanna leave this world without saying I love you, without saying what you mean to me. You know it makes me happy. Oh, when we share this space and time, want you to know you shaped this heart of mine. And I never wanna leave this world, without saying I love you.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Dandino, and I'm the artistic executive. This is what happens when you're at home trying to film things. No tripod. I'm the executive artistic director of Playhouse Arts, the Arcata Playhouse here on the North Coast. We are 6 hours north of San Francisco and 8 hours south of Portland, right in the heart of the Redwoods on the coast. In this time, we've seen wildflowers, of course, in the spring, wild fires right now. We've seen COVID and social and civil unrest. It's a devastatingly hopeful time for us here as it is for everyone. So what we're doing as an organization is we're not opening our doors mostly until the fall of 2021 is what we're looking at. And we're looking at how we can use what we have and the skills that we have to really support our community at this point, because we all believe that the arts are an essential service. So how we as artists engage in discussions moving forward of who we are as a world and who we are as a community, I think is one of the most important things we're doing. We're also doing a lot of public art. So we have James Hildebrandt is doing a piece called Keep the Giant Jolly, which is a very large sculpture that we've been working on over 2 years. And it connects with our Artists in Schools project to look at a creek called the Jolly Giant Creek and how we can work these art things together and really bring some attention to our environment. It's become very apparent to us that the arts are an essential service and that we need to get ourselves out into our society for mental health, for social health, to really allow people to find empathy and understanding, the basis of what the arts do, that ancient thread of using the arts to communicate.
Right now, I'm talking to you from the Arcata Community Forest. And this is one of the places where I'm coming to create and to train and to work. I'm a dance and theater artist. And this is a way that I'm managing all the crises, the civil unrest, the forest fires, the climate change crisis, the pandemic. So how we here as artists, how we're managing is using public spaces and how we inhabit those in a safe way, how we use masks and distance ourselves from one another. So I'm trying to continue to keep the fire burning, the creative fire, and trying to stay connected with nature and with my community.
This opportunity may not have ever been given to us like it is handed to us, thrust upon us right now. So devastatingly hopeless, devastatingly hopeful. Those are the words that run through my psyche right now, because I think people are seeing that the arts are really, really important and that they promote gathering and who we are as a community. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fireside chat with the lovely Sarah Smarsh. Sarah, it's so great to be in conversation with you this afternoon.
Likewise, Benya, I've been looking forward to this. And hello to everybody out there yonder.
Yes. So I'm sure many folks who are tuning in already know of you and know of your many titles. Sarah, you are a journalist who has reported for the New York Times and The Guardian, as well as many other publications, most perhaps famously known for your first book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. I am a huge fan of that first book and now also a fan of your most recently published second book about Dolly Parton, She Come By It Natural. But perhaps just by way of introduction, a piece of your introduction, your story that I love, that for folks who have not read Sarah's work, I think something that makes you so distinctive in the voice that you bring, Sarah, is that you are able to thread these careful, thoughtful, systematic analyses of thinking of, rural life and what that means of being rural in America, but also thread your own personal connection and landscapes of Kansas. And I know you're talking about some of that Kansas that you also throw in. And so really, here in conversation, excited to talk about your book, but also, again, to hear how you thread, both your own narrative in this analysis, but also now the opportunity to have your narrative also be threaded in with Dolly's. And so we're going to have a great conversation together around all things rural, feminism, Dolly Parton, and whatnot. But to begin first with maybe a mark of gratitude, another piece of what I love about you and your work has been your Homecomers podcast. And in my work, I know I've shared this personally with you, but when I co-founded Lead for America, I remember moving back home to Minnesota and having a lot of people think that this act of homecoming was bound to fail from the get-go. And the thing that sustained me as I was finding host communities and fellows who were excited about this was your Homecomers podcast and the stories of homecoming you shared. So I felt like really in the beginning days, it was me and Sarah on the wild road together. So it's very special and a big dose of gratitude for being here.
Thank you for that. And, when folks tell me that something I did connects with their story, that's why I do what I do. And you all know, as folks who are from or live in or care about rural America, that we don't always have narratives that represent the best of us and our intentions. So thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of I'd love to begin maybe with that intersection of these two big books that you've published, Heartland, which is kind of your story of thinking of home, how it fits into larger narratives of home, and this act of homecoming. So with your podcast, and also some of the themes of leaving that I heard reflected in Dolly's, in your book about Dolly. In particular, there was this line that I'm just going to read and kind of ask your thoughts of how you think about the interplay here. But in this book, She Come By It Natural, this one line that I really loved, you said, whether penniless Dolly Parton refusing to stay in a holler or affluent Dolly Parton looking at the door of Porter Wagner's studio, leaving was a revolutionary act. It is a power that has, over the years, brought textile mills, coal companies, and rich corporations to their knees when gender and poverty intersect and working women have had enough. And I read this one paragraph as I also thought of how you describe homecoming as people who are committed to preserving and strengthening the vibrancy and inclusiveness of small towns, rural lands, and misunderstood communities that headlines claim are dying. So I hold both of these pieces in my head, and I'd love to kind of ask you, how do you view this interplay between leaving and homecoming? Is one essential to the other, or what's their relationship?
Well, that is a brilliant question. If we answer it with a Dolly lens, we might look first at her departure from her place of origin, which was Poor Holler in East Tennessee. She was a talented musician from a very young age. She knew what she wanted to do from childhood. And the day after she graduated high school, I believe having been the first from her family to do so, she got on a bus for Nashville, which, while within the state boundaries, might as well have been on another planet in terms of, it being a bustling metropolis and the center of power for the industry that is the country music genre. And so that departure represented a lot of aspects of what I kind of assert in this book amount to a working class feminism. So some years ago, quite famous feminist text came out called Lean In, or there was this advice going around that one should lean in as a woman facing various sorts of adversity in a man's world, tear down the patriarchy by, fighting for to share the spoils of your office space or your home, and the presumption that I found sort of baked into that advice was sort of that, like, that space was already hospitable enough that is worth sticking around to help to try to change, or that you, more importantly, have enough agency, whether that's cultural, economic, political, and so on, to write that place so that it is hospitable to you and who you are. And this, we could broaden this out to talk about all sorts of people who have been marginalized in their home place or the place where they reside for various reasons, whether it's race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and so on. So her leaving, it represented a declaration of self and power, when she's saying, like, y'all laughed at me when I said that I was going to strike out independently as a female, not to go find a husband, but rather to fulfill myself. And the patriarchal space in which she grew up, her grandfather was a pastor, and she was very much shamed in the very home that she loved for her impulses toward self-expression that were, they couldn't afford makeup, so she'd take like burned matchsticks and use them as eyeliner. She pierced her own ears and hung feathers from her ears. She'd tease her hair and wear tight clothes, and this kind of early country version of the, very kind of provocative presentation that Dolly Parton is known for. When she was a kid doing that kind of thing, that was like Jezebel, So she was shamed and punished often for just kind of expressing her true self. I say this as someone who cares very much about rural America, as does Dolly Parton, who, by the way, has spent her entire life continually returning to home in the storytelling in her songs, the direction that her philanthropy flows, the centering of much of her business empire in the Smoky Mountains that she still calls home. And so we can at once be sort of fortifying ourselves against the aspects of home that need to be shed, that need to be left, and simultaneously be loving and abiding and protecting and preserving and improving the place that we come from. So, like, what has Dolly Parton done over the course of being a sort of ambassador of her place? She has embodied a loving presence. She has accepted all people. She has made efforts to, frankly, improve her home and the culture of where she comes from in various ways. And so that sort of full circle return, it's like, this is kind of the oldest archetypal story in human history, is the departure. You gain assets and understandings and wisdom that you then take back home, and it is then a gift to the place that you came from. The reason that story is worth talking about is because the United States, and particularly a late capitalist version of it, for so many young people, including, I was born in 1980, so I'm 40. When I was a kid in the 80s, there was already this message of like, get out. You got to get out. Nobody was telling me take up the family farm. They're like, the family farm is over, and maybe it breaks our hearts, but it is dwindling and we can't keep at it. And we maybe didn't understand the forces at work that made that so, but it was so. And the messages that I and so many people from rural America were receiving, it was all about get out, but nobody talked about come back, because it's all about that aspirational class ladder in the United States of you go wherever commerce is hopping and your salary can be maximized. Well, for me as a member of the media industry, that would be New York City. I lived there for a few years, and that's when I knew, that it would involve some professional sacrifices and certainly some financial sacrifices, but Kansas is where I belonged. So in my mid-20s, I moved back and kind of dedicated myself to a humble parallel, I hope, to what I just described in Dolly's storytelling.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. And I love that framing of like, what gift, right, do you have to bring? And it's this like notion of reciprocity that I think is just, I think, as souls that we hunger for of what can I give to, and knowing also that how much you get from this sense of belonging to place and like this level of accountability. And I think another aspect too, perhaps way more personal, but there were themes in here that I think perhaps, maybe women who have had to leave cycles of violence, either it's place-based violence and a position of extreme poverty, or interpersonal, which I think there were some, obviously, some examples or themes of ways that Dolly has had to overcome such a challenge, is that how do you know, and maybe you can speak to this either in what you would infer that Dolly knew of where that spark of power came in, or perhaps yourself, of what was there a moment perhaps when you knew that coming back was of a powerful act and like one of agency that maybe now felt different than feeling maybe that you couldn't make it out in New York, or and how do you grapple with, was there a moment? And if there are folks who are listening in now that are thinking about what are the cycles of violence I need to leave, but if I were to come back, what would make it different?
Well, the moment for me, well, first I should say that one of the blessings of my life, and I bet a lot of people tuning in share this, has to do with a deep knowing about where my home was on the earth. Like I had a very chaotic upbringing in terms of my family, which I've written about, but one of the treasures of my upbringing had to do with a real closeness to the natural world and to place in a very literal, not a metaphorical way, but like the physical earth and like the lines of longitude and latitude on this planet. Like there is a spot in a particular state that feels like where my soul is tethered. And that never left me, even when I was presuming that I was going to have to go to other places to do the sorts of things that I'm meant to do professionally. Now, as for why I came back so soon in that journey and sort of took on the challenges that were related to that, it probably, while I might not have been conscious of it at the time, had a lot to do with the fact that So I talk and write a lot about socioeconomic class as an aspect of American identity that is a fairly nascent conversation for us in a country that has for centuries been denying that we even have a class structure. The American dream and the idea of the individual bootstraps being pulled up, and if you work hard, you get what you earn, and so on. That I think that it's a more mainstream reckoning with the falsehoods of those narratives is going on right now. Those conversations weren't happening yet when I was in my early 20s and setting off for New York. And so when I was receiving, very direct and blatant messages from my peers and colleagues and people in that environment that where I came from was shameful, that the fact that I was well-spoken must mean that I'm somehow exceptional or different from the backwards fools were back home. And it was like, I guess it's a little bit meta that I was starting out in the communications field. I was a journalist and still am, and was realizing the extent to which so many of the people who set the narratives about the place I come from didn't know anything about it. So I suppose the turning point for me was a realization, because how I always come. The reason that I got into journalism was very much out of a sense of civic duty. I wanted to be perhaps a government watchdog, or at the very least someone who was writing about injustice and shining a light on things that people needed to understand and talk about. But how could I, coming from where I do, be of service in that way most effectively? It occurred to me meant going home so that I would not be writing about a place or a people in the rearview mirror, writing from that place and being true to it in every way. And by the way, though, it wasn't like some sacrifice. I love living in rural Kansas, and folks thought I was nuts for making that decision. But that was also, by the way, at a moment, this is the early 2000s, when the media industry is just sort of like unraveling with the advent of the digital era. And a lot of people were being laid off, and newspapers didn't know what to do, and young journalists didn't have jobs. And so it was all the more crazy to go to a place where all the newspapers are folding, because at least in New York City, there are these, like legacy institutions that have enough wealth that they're going to survive that shift. So on paper, it was a terrible decision, but it was the right decision in my heart. And as it goes, when you listen to that piece of yourself, I think things worked out.
Yeah. Something I'm always struck when talking with you is the commitment to and value of being proximate to the story. And I guess on this notion of thinking of narratives that we are hearing about, it's hard to detach, us speaking today being a week away from a very important election. And so I was another kind of quote in your book that I thought a lot about. And, without kind of getting partisan here, I think this notion always, in politics is that, and I think especially now, is these narratives of who's claiming to be more of the people than the other. And we're grappling with these narratives, meanwhile, at our most human levels, right, that we as a society are quick to dehumanize the other in many of our most local institutions. Church halls, the 4-H clubs, city halls, and local elections seem to be dwindling and kind of maybe sometimes polarized in their own narratives. And something that I love that you wrote about with Dolly, so to bring Dolly into the space here, you mentioned how, among the 2016 presidential election, you said Dolly Parton was a balm of sorts, a spiritual leader when political leaders are failing. And like any transcendent storyteller, her politics occur at the human level, examined as experience rather than abstract concepts, and lived directly rather than bandied in academic terms. And so curious, what does this mean for you to have our politics occur at the most human level, both how your style of journalism is occurring and being brought, it seems, to the most human level. But what does it mean for now, as we're a week away from elections? What's the need, or how can our politics embody this Dolly spirit of occurring at the most human level at both national, state, and, even our most hyperlocal?
Wow, what a great question, and the way you framed it. So my context for my direct answer quickly would be that in 2016, when I started working on this project, which originally was serialized in a great roots music magazine called No Depression, over the course of 2017, it was that fraught election year of 2016, which you mentioned, and there was a lot of misogyny in the air that year. And a lot of talk about feminism, I would say like feminism with a capital F, like as a proper movement of sorts. And I talked about before how my lens on, sort of critiquing American society very much has to do with socioeconomic class. And that straddling a sort of class line, as I do, coming from a struggling family wheat farm and working among New York media professionals, and I'm coming to you from rural Kansas right now, by the way. I live here, but my work and my headspace is often in dialogue with folks in Manhattan. So that long time now straddling of a so-called divide that has just been my day-to-day reality has developed in me a real sensitivity to the differences between how a movement or social progress expresses itself at different rungs of the class ladder. So And Dolly Parton had a new album, and she was doing this big arena tour in 2016. And I was realizing, like, okay, there's all this talk about feminism, and like, wow, the irony that this woman who has said before in interviews that she is averse to the term herself, as are many of the women who raised me for various reasons, she nonetheless, by my definition of feminism, like exquisitely embodies the tenets of that philosophy, that if we just distill it to its essence, is very simply that all genders are equal and should be treated equally and equitably. So that's why I started writing about Dolly as this kind of springboard to talk about a working class version of feminism that maybe doesn't get its due when we talk about which women should and shouldn't receive credit for our gender's progress. How that relates to this moment has to do, I think, with if within ourselves we can examine the how far is the distance between what you are saying and tweeting and signaling and wearing on a t-shirt. So like, right now I'm wearing my ACLU t-shirt that says "Let People Vote." I'm also wearing a button that says "Dolly for President." That's beside the point. But so I'm walking around with a shirt that said "Let People Vote." What am I doing about that? Because if I'm not doing nothing about that, then this shirt is at best, kind of hollow virtue signaling, and at worst, a really kind of destructive sort of hypocrisy. And there is a strain of that runs through politics on both sides of the aisle. This talking a whole bunch of talk, but are you walking the walk? And in the case of, feminism, it is absolutely true that a lot of the women who raised me but have nothing to do with a feminist movement, they're not wearing t-shirts that say the word, they're killing it at feminism in a way that some women that are from more privileged backgrounds and will be seen at the march, where my family isn't present because because they couldn't get off work or get childcare, whatever. We need to examine within our own hearts and minds whether those two things are reconciled, our statements and our actions in our heart of hearts.
Yeah, that is so true. And I think of, so I, similarly also moved back to my hometown of Waseca, Minnesota. And when I was on that road trip, I was looking for who were these local change makers in town. And I realized that in every town I visited, I could name a handful of women who were always walking the talk and really were the ones calling the shots, but you could never find them upon a Google search. And in so many cases, they were guardians and shepherds of their communities, but would cringe or really not want to ever kind of put a label or a statement on what they were doing. And so I think that's a really salient point. And there's another Dolly quote that kind of makes me think a lot about this moment with COVID-19. And we have a question here also from Lindsay Wilson via Crowdcast. She says, women are leaving the workforce at 4 times the rate of men, predominantly to provide unpaid labor of caregiving to children. The pandemic is nowhere close to ending, and another huge percentage of women considering leaving the workforce because of the incredible pressures to juggle too much. If they do. What are your thoughts on what will be the impacts of so many women leaving the workforce, especially in rural places? And I'm going to pair that up just with a moment of bringing Dolly into this conversation here. You had also talked about how towards the end of your book, that once Dolly, she had achieved this level of fame and fortune, she hustled toward all her life, bottomed out emotionally, and found herself the same woman she'd always been, yet psychologically reborn. What would be the next goal? There was only one thing left to do: create her own damn world. And I'm pairing that up here with Lindsay's question, because this essence of the phrases that really stick with me is psychologically reborn and let's create our own damn world. What does that mean when we think of women in the workforce, the pressures of COVID-19, the transformation that's having psychologically on us. What are these elemental parts of Dolly's own damn world do you think can lead us into the rebuilding post-COVID-19?
Well, that moment that I described in the book in Dolly's kind of professional and personal trajectory was kind of on the heels of her very successful entry into Hollywood as a movie star. And she had a great experience on some of those movie sets, but on some of them not so much, to such an extent that it was actually traumatic to be a female who was for one, sexually objectified for her gender, and very self-consciously so, and in some ways, and perhaps even feminist ways, she participated in that. But her experience in the man's world of Hollywood was very hard on her. There was an additional layer of the classism that she experienced coming from a rural place, having a twang in her voice, not being formally, quote unquote, educated, and so on. So around midlife, she was in her, I guess she wasn't quite to 40. She had what people then called a nervous breakdown. She just sort of collapsed and fell into a depression. And she actually talks quite candidly in some of her earlier writings about considering taking her own life, actually. So then, and that line that section ends on, where she's like, okay, she gets right with herself. She asks for help. She receives that help. She is like rebuilding herself. And so then it's like, what is the next step? And the next step was she went back to, Pigeon Forge, and against all advice of her male attorneys and accountants, she created a business called Not Hollywood, Dollywood. And if you think that it's just a cute little play on the word, I think you're underestimating how intentional she is in, just Gandhiing the hell out of her professional career, by which I mean she is the change she wishes to see in the world. So what she lamented about Hollywood was that her people and place was reduced to a caricature. It was profited on by people who didn't care about it, and so on. So she situates Dollywood in a place where it will employ generations of people, including her own family and folks from low-income households. And then this kind of, business behemoth of tourism grows around it. And I believe a University of Tennessee study a few years ago found that her business mark on the state economy is something like $1.5 billion a year. So how does that all relate to the extremely unfortunate and disturbing reality that, as the questioners noted, legions, droves of women are being forced to leave the workforce to care for children and probably also elders. And we get through this crisis on the unpaid labor of females, as we have gotten through many crises and eras before. And it is unequivocally a loss in the long, arc of justice. This is certainly a setback, and it will be felt for generations to come. But I love that you kind of, Benya, wove in that point where Dolly sort of rises up and she's like, now what am I gonna build? Because in this moment, as systems are deteriorating and structures are falling, while unfortunately the most vulnerable among us, whether in terms of gender or race or otherwise, suffer from that seismic destruction of sorts, the worst. Even yet, in that space, there is the potential for rebuilding. And so long as those marginalized populations are at the table of talking about how the rebuilding is going to go down and what it's going to look like, there is potential for this moment to be a boon for women and a boon for people of color, in terms of, like, if we're going to use this, learn the lessons of our times to create structures that are more equitable. So it is a simultaneous, as in the parable of Dolly, a simultaneous loss and potential and opportunity for real growth.
Yeah. And there's a really great question that just came in too that I think goes off of, captures, I think, some of of Dolly's journey and the sense of, I love the psychological reborning or the rebirth that I think also comes with an understanding and appreciation of your worth. So right at the beginning, we were talking about what does it mean to leave cycles of violence? And I think there's I can't find the quote at this moment, but I remember, throughout the book, you talk about how Dolly's music always is homecoming, regardless of wherever she is. She talks about her place, about her people. And even the way she has this self-deprecating humor at concerts and the ways that she talks about her, experiences that are deeply traumatic in extreme poverty. And we have Maggie King here with a question saying, can you talk about your journey of realizing your story is unique and worth being told, as well as any advice for aspiring storytellers to find this confidence within themselves? So was there a moment perhaps when you were, Sarah, psychologically reborn and seized perhaps this ownership and even pride and recognition of the worth of your fifth generation wheat farming connection?
Yeah. Maggie, thanks for that question. And it gave me goosebumps actually when Benya read it, because this, regardless of whether you're a storyteller or what gifts you bring forth and in what way you participate in the rebuilding and re-envisioning of rural America, this is the essence of whether that mission lives or dies, is one's deeply rooted belief in not just the worthiness of the cause, but the worthiness of yourself to participate in the cause. And if you're a storyteller, that means that you're up against a society that does not value folks who have a more artistic bent as much as it values other trades and crafts. So that's sort of like strike one for self-confidence. The paycheck's lower, and the paycheck signals then that there is less value, because that dollar sign and the monetary correlation is supposed to somehow in our society represent worth. It doesn't, of course. And so you got to get right with well, first of all, I know from Maggie asking the question that she believes in her own voice, because she used it to speak, and that is a power. But when you come from a rural space, or you're advocating for a faction of our society, and this applies in all sorts of senses, that is frequently diminished, frankly, in national discourse, then there's a cultural mark now against self-confidence and fortitude on the path. So, and I was actually thinking, I'm a trail runner, and I was on a trail run this morning, and I was thinking about how just the chaos of this moment, and how many crises are going on at once, and how different people are faring. And I thought, I just had this sense of because that isn't going to let up anytime soon, by the way. We're deep in it, and we're probably going to get even deeper in it. And whether you are a storyteller, or an aspiring policymaker, or a scientist, or someone developing perennial wheat grains for the purpose of sustainable agriculture, right now we need you to be so centered and in an abiding belief in yourself, which is not a selfish act. It is, in fact, the best gift that you can give our society and our times. Because if you let yourself get pulled asunder, then we can't benefit from what you have to give. So you know, as far as when did I have that moment, I one of the gifts of my life, I guess, is that even when I was a kid, if adults, you know, were hollering at me and criticizing me in an unkind way, I don't know how or why, but I just knew they were wrong. I thought, well, that ain't right. I'm fine. Nothing wrong with me, you know, not in an egotistical way, but just a discernment between personal truth and the often inaccurate and destructive messages that come at us all our lives, whether domestically, privately, publicly, politically, through pop culture and so on. So Maggie, I'll be watching for and listening for your voice.
I love that. And I love how you came back to this notion of gift. And when you think of yourself as an offering, I feel like the work that you do to recognize and claim your self-worth becomes less and less about you. And one of the notes actually going back to that, you know, the creation of Dollywood, you know, I think that has the potential of sounding very self-ego driven when you think of the, you know, the look of glamour that was always presented, I think, you know, and I think I fell into this trap too of like, before reading your book, I was like, okay, she's like, it's all about Dolly. But the more you dive into it and her story, you realize that Dolly's commitment to place and also I think commitment to God. You spoke about her Christian faith and the way that very publicly she also spoke about her Christian faith. Were some of the core shapers of like what created, you know, Dolly's world, and that Dollywood doesn't actually become about Dolly, but so plain, you said, is about seeing yourself worthy enough of being a gift for others. So just a comment on that I found deeply, deeply inspiring. And going off that theme of gift, I'm wondering if you can, you speak about Betty very beautifully. I feel like at this point, your grandmother, Betty, I feel connected to her, which I'm so glad for. But there is also one piece in your book that where you talked about the role of country music and its relationship with the rural women in your life, and this idea of the importance of representation, of who you see as being gifts to society. And so there's this line where you said that I can map my upbringing against a soundtrack of declarative statements sung by women in denim and big hair is one of my greatest blessings. We weren't a family of musicians, but the two women who raised me, my mom and grandma, cared a great deal about music that validated the stories of our lives. Working class girls, women, wives, mothers, in a way that TV shows, movies, books, magazines, and newspapers almost never did. And I think that quote stuck out to me because it highlighted all the ways in which, you know, that Dolly's inspiration, you know, or the ways in which you were able to see parts of yourself reflected back. You also did complicate too of the ways that Dolly represented, even, you know, at Dollywood, of, you know, changing Dixie Stampede to, you know, just Stampede. And I'm wondering of, you know, in this piece of amplifying now voices of rural women and trying to show the way that country music did that for you, I'm curious of what narrative, what's the responsibility of now the platform that you have to also really make sure that rural women who are underrepresented have their chance to be seen, but also thinking about the larger context of so many identities that don't have that privilege of being seen and represented in media. So thinking of, especially in this moment when we're getting a new national vocabulary around Black Lives Matter, where there's an urgency to center Black voice and representation. You talked about Nicki Minaj a bit in your book too. And I'm curious how you balance that need to claim your space and your voice and your gift. And then also center that while also thinking of all the other identities that go underrepresented. What role or responsibility do you have? And how do you make space in the distinctiveness, but also the shared underrepresentation?
Yeah. Well, one way that I'm trying to be of service to that moment in our evolution, hopefully moving toward a more equitable world and country in relationship to race, is that, and I hope I've been doing this for quite a few years, but it is more at the fore of my mind these days, is, always being attentive to, this might sound counterintuitive to some folks tuning in, but never neglecting to talk about the white part of where I come from. So while I talk about class, I aspire to do so in an intersectional way that's always acknowledging the ways in which that is in conversation with gender and race and other aspects of identity. And in my case, my identity has to do with what I describe as like a simultaneous racial privilege and economic disadvantage. And that is a conversation that's very difficult for some reason for a lot of people to have, because it's fraught, frankly, because I am a member of the same race who I'm talking to y'all from Kaw Nation homelands, and the fifth generation farming legacy I come from also has to do with the systematic attempted eradication of an indigenous people. So I'm always trying to own my kind of inheritance of that legacy of white supremacy and even genocide, while also talking about simultaneously, because the conversations we got to have for the nuance and the truth that is required of this moment, it's a lot of this and this, simultaneously. And so talking about white poverty and the folks who raised me, and like how do those interplaying problems connect, and there's a lot to be revealed when we can discuss things in a prismatic way like that. I would also say that that's just in terms of how I think about my work. But then your very important point about representation is something that I don't want to miss commenting on. I, for all my marginalization in terms of class and gender, still could see this blonde woman singing on the television and see something of myself in her. And of course, for people of color and folks who don't identify as I do as a cisgender heterosexual woman and so on, there's the conundrum of finding someone who represents you, whether in a physical sense or identity or ownership of a particular voice and experience. That experience is even more fraught than it was for me. So, I try to, in my work, lift up voices from communities who face even greater disadvantages than I ever did, whether that's through mentorship or just kind of professional connections that I can relate to, being born into a place that didn't have any connections, and yet all the same, unfortunately, I had the white skin walking into spaces that while I had to talk them into letting me in, ultimately they did. And were I a woman of color, that might not have been the case.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're getting to the end of our time, but I wanted to maybe ask one last question to set us off or on our way. And read again, towards the end of your book, you talk about some of us get so lost in the policy-centered discussion of feminism that we fail to look ruthlessly at the way we live our lives. What sort of country songs might be written about us? Would they be about the woman who is stuck or the one who is breaking free? And those questions, I think, are particularly salient as we are grappling with this larger question of our own national identity, of what it means to be rural, of what it means to be woman, white, Black, brown, Native, and really what it means to be American. And so hearkening back to Dolly again and bringing our girl in here, if you could choose a Dolly song that either captures this perhaps clashing moment of discernment that we find ourselves in as a nation, or perhaps a Dolly song that represents the American identity in its ideal, what would that song be?
This is so hard. And, you know, if you want to go for like tone and sound, then Dolly's early work, which is where you find the dark Dolly, and there's some dark layers down underneath all those wigs, I guarantee it. If you haven't listened to a lot of her early stuff, check it out. And it's very haunting Appalachian melodies that are often bearing witness to the trials, specifically of women, but just of, in a general sense, folks facing adversity and an uphill battle. And a lot of folks can relate to that general sentiment right now. But I'm actually going to go with a song from with a very different sound. A lot of times, just like the sort of paradox of her, you know, physically, intentionally embracing the physical symbols of what people call trashy, quote unquote. She juxtaposes that with, you know, her real true self that couldn't be more authentic and classy and beautiful. Similarly, a lot of her songs have a much heavier message than the sort of jaunty melody that's going on. And there's a song from 1978 called Two Doors Down. And this is from, it's kind of the disco era, and she had already had some crossover success. And this song, while you can hear some country in it, is definitely pop country and leaning toward pop on that continuum. And what that song is about, and it sounds very, you know, it's an upbeat tempo and melody, and you kind of, you know, dance and bob your head to it. But the song she's singing and the words of the song, the lyrics are quite profound in what she's getting at. So she's saying, I'm in my room and I'm crying. I'm feeling sorry for myself. And she can hear that 2 doors down, there's like a rager going on. And there's this great party. And so first I think of like the physical distance inherent in that is something that we can all vibe with right now, regardless of the context, you know, amid the pandemic and how that's affecting our proximity to people and ability to share.
It's made it clear that
But then what she's talking about and the purpose of the song is how she's like, we assume she's just been through some sort of breakup, because she says, you know, she's crying her eyes out. She's feeling sorry for herself. But she hears something more promising going on down the hallway, and she decides to, you know, she didn't deny her feelings. She didn't put a cork on her tears. She didn't pretend like nothing was wrong. She got it out. She acknowledged the difficulty of the moment. And then she stood up, dried her tears, and was like, damned if I'm not walking down to that party and going to have a good old time somehow. So she goes over, then, you know, there's also some romantic tryst involved. There's also like a sexual liberation song in that she like brings a guy home from the party. And it's quite scandalous to be singing such things as Dolly Parton in 1978. But we put that piece of the lyrics aside, that spirit of sort of indomitable optimism isn't quite the right word, but just human spirit and you know, wherewithal to see the next day and to find the beauty in it and to bring the best of yourself into that room is something that is going to be required of all of us, maybe especially on November 4th.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this always enlightening conversation and being in community with you. That last question was also my way of, if we were in person, I was going to totally play a walkout song for you. And so now you get this instead. So thanks for choosing that. And thank you, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you, Benya. Thank you so much for the great, brilliant interview.
Thank you, Benya and Sarah. It's such a wonderful fireside chat, and so glad to have you with us virtually at Rural Assembly Everywhere. Thank you both. And I'm Mary Sketch with the Rural Assembly. And we just wanted to thank you for being with us this afternoon for our main stage content. You're hearing from Kathleen Sebelius and Sarah Smarsh and Benya Kraus. And it's not over yet. We still have 2 awesome breakouts for you. Actually, one that is being led by Benya Kraus on rural homecomers and bringing in the next generation of rural homecomers. So if you like what you just heard, that breakout is starting at 5 p.m. And we also have another breakout on building climate resilience and the women of the climate change movement with the Women for the Land program. And that is also at 5 p.m. And we'll put those links in the crowdcast, as well as an email will be coming out to all registrants in about 15 minutes if you'd like to join, but didn't get the chance to register. And we also have a happy hour at 7:30 p.m. Eastern time tonight, and there's still room in that if anyone would like to sign up on our website at ruralassembly.org/everywhere. You can sign up for that, and we hope to see you there. That's with the Department of Public Transformation, Dakota Resources, and Springboards for the Arts. It'll kind of be a rural scrambler. You can network and meet other rural folks, rural admirers. And if you have missed any of our content the last couple days, just a reminder that it's available on YouTube as well as the Crowdcast page. If you go to that top left, you can click back through previous days. And there's a link on the Rural Assembly website as well. So thank you all so much for being with us. And we hope to see you in some breakouts and happy hours and back for more content tomorrow.